Okay. Thank you.
Got it. All right. So it occurs to me that the word justice has a whole lot of different meanings. And if we're going to talk about economic justice, we're going to have to talk about what that means in terms of definition of the word justice. One of the things John Dominic Crossan likes to talk about is he talks about distributive justice versus retributive justice, which he likes those big words. But we, a lot of times, especially in our country, when we say justice, we think about our justice system and how it means, bad guys getting their comeuppance, and, proper judgment, and we kind of project that on the Bible, and we say, well, when the Bible says, there'll be a final judgment, or Jesus is coming back to judge us, we think about it in terms of handing out rewards to those who should get them and punishments to those who should get them, and that's kind of what John Dominic Crossan calls retributive justice, getting what's due you. And the Bible is really much more about distributive justice, which in other words, a just means of sharing the earth's resources with one another. And in fact, what Dr. Horsley points out is that that the term particularly in Hebrew is can be translated a bunch of different ways. And so he says that when if you read something in the Bible that says like a prophecy that says, God will come and judge the earth, that could just as easily be translated as God shall come and establish justice on the earth, which can have a whole different flavor meaning than what we're typically used to thinking of the final judgment kind of thing. So, hi Janet, we're kicking around, just what does the word justice mean to you, and saying that when we talk about, say the final judgment or something, based on something that's in the Bible, that Dr. Horsley says that could just as easily be interpreted as God's justice will reign, which can be more of a everybody will have their fair share kind of definition of justice than everybody will get what's coming to them kind of definition of justice. So what are other people's thoughts about, how we use the word justice and how you're used to hearing the word justice as it is applied in the Bible? I can't hear you, Judy.
I just realized that. I'm on the side of distributive justice, particularly when talking about economic. Maybe political, I'm on the side of retributive.
Despite what's happening in our world and our country right now, I would have guessed that I would be thinking about what you said, Dan, wrongdoers get their comeuppance. But in fact, when you said justice, I thought we're going to talk about that. And I immediately thought, oh, fairness, which it's not that speaking on that side of things. But I guess really justice makes me think of, what's fair for everybody.
Is Oh, yeah, that is somebody. I'm just sorry. I just got a call from, I was trying to identify the name. Robert Cherry. That is a Southminster call. Somebody trying to get in. So let me talk amongst yourselves. Hi, it's Dan Rasmussen. Are you
Mute
trying to get
yourself,
it
Dan.
in? Yeah,
There you go. Now we can talk amongst ourselves. So justice, yeah.
It's definitely a new way of thinking about it in terms of how it's used in the Bible for me. Like growing up, for sure, it was used the other way a lot, the retributive way. But in our work, I see kind of a new movement. Like we do a lot of diversity, equity, inclusion work, and I hear more and more like them adding the J, which is meant, like more of the distributive, like kind of the highest ideal for all of those things, used as like justice. If justice is there, then you don't need to create equity situations as often. I'm not quite saying that correctly. Justice would reset the system so that fairness would be present, I guess, is the way I think it's being used more.
mhm.
But biblically, for sure, I've always heard it as like hell and damnation and like justice is God's, and
Yeah.
not used the other way.
Yeah, I mean, that was a real eye opener to me, just to take any of those places where it says, and God's justice will reign, and don't think about people getting their comeuppance, but think about God's system of justice being put in place in place of our screwed up systems of justice.
And we probably all heard the comment that the retributive justice comments in the Bible, where it's an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, is not, as is often used by those who want to lay everyone low, is instead there to say, if somebody knocks your tooth out, don't shoot them. Only take their front two teeth out.
Right.
I mean, in America, we have the statue of the blind person and the scales, right?
Right.
That's a whole nother side of it too, that goes with what you said from the pulpit on Sunday, Dan, about if something was a thing that money could buy. What was the song?
If religion was a thing that money could buy, the rich would live and the poor would die.
Right, and that's all my trials. Right.
Right. Yeah. So, and also speaking of Sunday, Scott, you gave us a really good starting point to talk about, that one way to look at the starting point of the Bible as being when they started writing stuff down, which was during and after the exile. And I struggle with, trying to talk about the Old Testament system of economic justice and find a starting point. So we're going to start here. We're going to start about 1200 BC. And what this is after there's a lot of stuff that happened before that we don't quite know about the historical accuracy of. So I didn't want to get into, Charlton Heston and the plagues, because that all, obviously that was a tradition that was around for hundreds of years before it was written down. And the longer the time span between when something happens and when it gets written down, the more kind of fanciful it gets. So, but what does appear to have happened historically is that about 1200 BC, a bunch of people moved into the hill country of Palestine. And archaeologists have confirmed that a lot of the villages, towns of the hilly part of the Holy Land of Israel were settled and established at that time. And what people think happened was that one way or another, people escaped the rule of the Egyptian Empire to the south and or the Hittite Empire to the north, and found their way into Palestine and kind of did this we don't want to be part of no empires no more thing. And this is kind of the beginning of the nation of Israel and the worship of Yahweh in a major way. Of course, a big old backstory to that was added, that there was a family that was part of, the descendants of Abraham that ended up in Egypt because of the famine, and then they eventually got out after a few hundred years in Egypt and made their way back to Canaan, where they were originally from. There's obviously some truth to that, but we don't need to go there. What's interesting is the system that they established when they settled in that area, which apparently that area that we know of as Palestine or Israel today was not heavily settled. It was always sort of a crossroads of trade between the different empires and peoples of the world, but it wasn't terribly desirable as a place to live. It was kind of hilly and kind of barren. And so, but people wanting to not be part of violent empires anymore kind of found it interesting as a place to live, because it was, you kind of got left alone. So, so they set up a system that could be summarized by saying, we don't need no stinking king, as their primary mantra. And so they organized life around villages and families and villages, and just kind of said, we're going to live our life with our family farm and take care of each other, and that's all we really need to do. It was a very simple agrarian system that they set up, and I'm going to show a little summary of that I wrote up here, of the basic principles of covenant economics, subtitled "It Takes a Village." Were that God owns the land. Each family has their little plot. No one goes hungry and no one loses their home. So you've got your family ancestral plot of land that's enough to feed your family and provide a little extra to take care of other people. And that plot of land will be your family's to work in perpetuity, and but the actual ownership of the land is all, the land all belongs to God, and God will provide everything. There's a strong sense of kind of sufficiency to this, that you have enough. God will take care of you. Go work your land and don't and take care of one another. And so that, yeah, it's me saying something. Okay. And the basic practices of how how to enforce number 3 and number 4 to make sure no one goes hungry and no one loses their home. Were, first of all, the Sabbath system, which we could spend a lot of time talking about that, but we all know the Sabbath system as being a rest every 7 days from your labor. And but there's also a resting every 7 years where you let the land go fallow every 7 years. And then there's the year of Jubilee, which is in the law, but people argue about whether it ever actually happened. Which is that at the end of 50 years or 77 times 7 years, there's a 50th year where all debts are forgiven and all slaves go free and everything gets reset. So if you've fallen on such hard times that you've had to let somebody else take over your land or whatever, it all gets reverted back and everything goes back to the way it was every 50 years. A really key piece of that for how to take care of making sure no one goes hungry was the concept of gleaning. And I think we're kind of familiar with that idea, but it's it goes along with Sabbath, particularly the every 7 years part, because if every 7 years you're not working your land and it's just growing, it's still going to grow some stuff. You know, while you're doing nothing every 7 years, your land is still going to grow some stuff. And it was perfectly acceptable for people who didn't have their own plot of land or needed food for whatever reason to come in and pick what they could pick from your land during that 7th year. And it's highly likely that at the very beginning, the 7-year cycle was not standardized. So it wasn't like every single family was taking the same year off. The way the laws are written, it sounds kind of like they're more staggered, which allowed even better gleaning prospects if there was some piece of land in the village that was not being farmed every 7 years that you could glean off of. And the other thing I'd say about gleaning is that the code specifically mentions, we think of it as being like the poor and the widows and the orphans. The one thing that's mentioned consistently in the rules about gleaning is the stranger, the person dwelling among you from a foreign country who doesn't have their own plot of land. And so the implication is that there were plenty of people who were escaping oppressive systems and trying to find a home amongst the Hebrew people that would, dwell among them and live off them as best they could, but they wouldn't have their own plot of land. Whereas in theory, every Hebrew family would have a home piece of land to work from. And the last thing I'll mention then is the other, if your neighbor falls on hard times, we could probably brainstorm some of the things that could go wrong when you're just doing a family farm in a village. Obviously if the weather's bad or the yields are bad in a particular year, everybody's going to kind of suffer that together. But your other things that are going on, you're heavily dependent on your work animals. If you have your mule comes up lame, and that affects your ability, or you're also heavily reliant on your offspring. You have children to help you work the farm. If your neighbor has no children, or maybe has a you know, their number one son is killed in a tragic accident or something. There's a lot of different ways we can think of that a family farm would fall on hard times. The primary way of dealing with that was that neighbors should lend freely to their neighbors who need it without really expecting to be paid back. Definitely not profiting off of their misfortune, not charging interest, not taking a lot in collateral, blah, blah, blah. The idea was to lend them what they need to get back on their feet, and not take advantage of people who are in economic hard times. That was kind of the system that was set up that apparently worked for maybe a couple hundred years before some national security concerns kicked in and stuff. But let's stop and talk there about how does that system sound? What do you think are the pros and cons of that kind of economic system? Does it mean anything to us today to look back at a system like that?
One thing that occurs to me about it is it seems like it's very much based on a face-to-face small community. And it's kind of like, you know, there were aspects of that, maybe even in, I don't know what the economics were like here in the United States in early years with settlers and smaller communities. But, you know, that, and they, of course, they do mention strangers a little bit, but that kind of system seems like it works a lot better when people really know each other and they stay in the same place for years or generations. So, you know, it's dependent on, in my opinion, it seems like it's kind of dependent on that, because you don't have enforcers, or I guess I would ask, what kind of enforcers did they have of this? So it seems like it was more of just a community agreements.
Yeah, ideally it was just kind of self-enforced. There were, we do know from the Bible that during this period of time, they appointed judges. And so there were people that helped settle any disputes that couldn't be handled at the local village level.
It seems that it would be really dependent upon trust. And also, I think the enforcement would be social pressure.
Absolutely.
I think it's in Mexico after the Mexican Revolution in 1910, and they took the big haciendas and big land holdings and had major agrarian reform. This is exactly the system they set up. I don't know if anybody's familiar with them, the ejidos, and the land belonged to the people of that, the large ejido, and each family was given a parcel of land that they could work. And
You only see one at a time. I think I've seen 4.
They could work it. They could not sell it, but they could pass it down from generation to generation. And it worked very well until big agriculture wanted to come in and start buying up the land. And then there was a change of government, and they're trying to privatize the parcelas so that each land, so that the families that have been allotted these pieces of land are now able to sell them. And so
Yeah, you should.
it's kind of breaking up, but it works. And
Where it goes to bed.
And in terms of agrarian reform, it was considered a very fair system of allowing the peasants who had been working that land for generations now owned it. Not individually, but collectively. So it's very familiar to me.
I stopped your screen sharing, Dan, just because I thought I wanted to see who was talking.
Okay, that's fine. Yeah, what I'm intrigued by gleaning being a really primary way of sharing. And I know there's lots of modern kind of gleaning projects and things that, you know, help poor people get food by various means. And what's interesting about it to me is that it's not a handout. It's an opportunity for needy people to find a way to take care of themselves that doesn't leave them, you know, indebted to somebody for their help.
Yeah, it strikes me that it all kind of like revolves around the idea that the land is God's.
Mhm.
Kind of like now, like if we think about someone trying to own water or air, I mean, it's such an anti-American idea now that land could be seen more like the Native American idea of, you know, nobody can own it. Like what a preposterous idea. But if like you were saying, if the land is God's and then you're just there to pick something up off of it, then you're not indebted to someone else who you see to own it. I don't see how in America we could ever roll back to that idea.
Well, there's some real interesting echoes in like the Homestead Act and some that the idea that every family ought to have a place to live and farm and feed themselves kind of echoes through our history. Even in the Civil War era, where some people had the wisdom to say, well, each freed slave ought to be given 40 acres and a mule, which of course never happened. But you know, it's the same kind of deal. People recognized that in order to be, you know, a viable part of the economic system, a person needed some land and an animal or two to work it.
I could jump in.
Yeah.
In seminary, the genesis of the history of Israel that we were taught at the time came from actually one book and a scholar who just died very recently in his 90s, whose name was Norman Gottwald, who wrote a book called The Tribes of Yahweh. And he described the first peoples as those who lived in the hill country, the craggy hill country of Israel, who weren't exactly agrarian to a great degree, only to a small degree, and that they were dependent upon raiding the valleys where the Canaanites lived, and getting what they really needed to survive, and then going back up into the hill country where they had full protection because those on the plains and the flat areas got around very quickly on chariots, but the chariots were absolutely no good in the foothills or the hills, and so they called God El Shaddai, which means God of the mountain. And they had verses like God is my rock and you know my hiding place, pretty much, which goes with all of that. And the point being that what we're talking about now was probably never fully implemented, but was a a thoughtful idea that came out of whatever it is, out of their history as a desirable kind of outcome.
Hmm.
So what? Who knows? But, yeah, every generation has its new stories. But that made some sense of the oldest texts. How's that?
Yeah.
I don't know anything about how these societies work, but this makes me sort of wonder, how does Amish society deal with inequity and sharing of our abundance with all members of society? As I said, I don't know anything about it, but it kind of seems to me that maybe there's an attempt to follow this principle.
I would imagine there's something of that in there. Amish and Mennonite living.
Right.
Well, and I would suggest that in general, and that one of the aspects of all this economic justice stuff that we want to get into eventually, we've talked about is better understanding of the urban-rural divide in our area and in our country. And I would say that if you went out into a rural area, one of the prominent attitudes you would hear is, we don't need no stinking government coming in to tell us how to take care of each other. We can take care of our neighbors just fine. We don't need big government. We don't need big welfare programs, blah, 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 because we can take care of each other. I'm sure we've all heard that at one time or another.
Right. Ron Paul used to talk about the fact that if somebody needed a kidney transplant, the church would have a bake sale and everyone would get together and they'd throw money in a hat and they'd pay for it. But of course, now with transplants costing $50,000 or whatever it is or more, it's a little harder to do.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was just remembering those self-insured like co-ops that they had, seemed like for a while, and they weren't working out very well, because people would give low donations, and then the idea was that the co-op, it was usually Christian, the Christian co-op would then pay for everybody's medical care, but of course they really weren't able to, if anybody had any, and they wanted to be exempt from needing to pay for health insurance.
Right.
I grew up in a small town in Iowa, rural community, and that's exactly what it was like. I don't know if it's like that anymore. I can remember raising money for kidney transplants and all kinds of things. The community would come together and we'd raise the money and get that person sent off to Iowa City for their surgery. And it was totally the way it was. And it may not be that way now. I don't know.
Well, it's that way now on the internet with GoFundMe accounts for everything. And it's
Yeah,
because there's
exactly.
because
heard-
our health insurance has not been able to keep up, and people,
No.
for at least till recently, they felt they couldn't afford to pay the premiums, so they would go without, and then they just have to have GoFundMe.
I've heard perfectly reasonable people suggest that as a solution, not just a stopgap, but it's like, you talk about health care reform and talk about these really expensive procedures that, and then people get stuck with all this money, and people will say, well, there's GoFundMe.
Yeah.
Another thing in a small town, like for example, if one of the family farmers would have a health concern or any kind of an emergency, all the other farmers would go together and put in their crop or pick the crop. I mean, it was really very much a helping each other environment, because small town, it's just kind of the way it is. Did any of the rest of you grow up in small towns? Am I the only one? Maybe.
I think
Did,
Klamath Falls is is a medium small town, but
Yeah. 2,000 people, that's my small town.
Well,
Yeah.
I'm not unfamiliar with the concept. I didn't grow up in one, but I mean, I think we all have some connection with that. But the question is, where does that kind of a system, where does it work well? Where is it not going to meet the needs of everyone?
And does it actually get lost as people move from rural to urban environments, or does it just take different forms in an urban environment?
I think that's the point. I think the spirit is there in an urban environment, but it's within communities that may not be as obvious because they're all in one great big place. When in a small rural community, everybody knows everybody.
Right.
And the other thing is that there usually is one disaster at a time that
Right.
the group can deal with. But when you put so many people into city space when they don't know each other, they're lost.
Right.
Well, what would that system of covenant justice look like in the city? Because it dawns on me that it really relies on a lot of agreement that everybody is a farmer. Right? Like you all do the same kind of labor towards the same goals. What if you're an artist and you don't want to be a farmer? So
Right.
like, or what does it look like if you're in a city and
Yeah.
you
It's
don't
not
have
the
the
same.
same goal, right?
I think Janet's absolutely right. I mean, I lived in Myrtle Point, which was about 3,000. And when somebody got burned out, everything stopped in that town that day. And that will never happen in Klamath Falls or Portland or Beaverton, where everybody gives their attention to the family for as long as it takes to get them back on their feet. They organize immediately. And if it's a Sunday morning, the optometrist opens up, and the lady who got out without even her glasses will have glasses before 10 in the morning. That's how that works. And there's nothing like it anywhere else. You have to be in that tiny size community. I was really glad to have been there, even if I was only there, for a year.
And those kind of things still happen in a city, but they're hidden with all the surrounding people. And I mean, there may be an optometrist that comes in at the last minute and fills the prescription or fixes the glasses.
But in the town of 2,000, everybody knows that they have something that they can do.
Bingo.
Yeah.
Right.
And whereas
There
here
you go.
we'd have to make it up. Yeah.
I noticed that happens in apartment complexes, that they build community and around food and meals and kids. And I mean, they just build community, but I think it requires, a certain, like the proximity thing is what it is.
I was thinking.
In
No,
an
go ahead,
urban
Dan.
environment, you need to be more intentional about building community. You're not just dropped in one that's automatically there for you.
I think that you're exactly right, Chris, that the proximity or the community of an apartment complex, I think, would lend itself to this sort of thing. People have to know one another and know what the needs are. As you were talking about how does it happen in a city, it reminded me of a limited series that was on a couple of years ago about an old apartment building. And I'll make up that it was New York, but I don't really even remember that. And it was like that all the people in this, I mean, of course it was fiction, but all the people in this apartment building knew one another and looked out for one another and took care of one another. But that was the basic theme, that it was a community based upon the fact that they all lived in this building.
Hey,
I wanna move this
Janet,
ahead.
how does Viva Village try to work a little bit like this.
I was thinking about that. It kind of tries to pick up the pieces for seniors and create a sense of community and caring for one another, providing help to them as they need it, being able to refer them. So that's the attempt, is to provide a village for people who choose to age at home so that they aren't as isolated socially, and help them. So yeah, it's an attempt to help with that. And I think churches can do that too. I think
Mhm.
people need to feel they belong to a community where you care about one another. But it doesn't happen naturally in an urban environment. You have to create those spaces.
Right. I want to move us along and get through a couple more pieces of this this evening. I think we're kind of familiar with Exodus chapter 20. We know it as the 10 Commandments. Dr. Horsley does a good job of going through this in depth that I can't quite get into tonight, but the idea is once you've got a picture of this kind of covenant economic system that we're dealing with, these commandments read quite a bit differently. So let me just take a quick scan through them. When God says, I brought you out of Egypt, you shall have no other gods before me, and you shall not make yourself any idols. We usually give a real kind of theological interpretation to that. But when you put yourself into this village economic system that they're talking about and compare it to what they had experienced, say, in Egypt or in empires, it takes on a new meaning, at least to me, and it's kind of the people in Egypt and Mesopotamia and other places had a lot of gods. They dealt with a lot of forces. All of the wind and the rain and the weather and the earthquakes and all of that stuff were forces that were beyond their control. And so they did a lot of worshiping and sacrificing, whatever they thought would help their crops mature that year. And not to mention, fertility gods and all of that kind of stuff. So what Horsley says is when the 10 Commandments say, don't have other gods, it's Yahweh saying, I'm sufficient, don't go looking for, ways, other things that are going to help you or ways to appease the forces of the universe. Just kind of stick with the system and you'll be fine. Again, that kind of idea of sufficiency. I'm enough. You don't need all that other stuff. And then it goes on to to talk about the Sabbath day, and we talked about how it was important to their economic system. But again, that sense of sufficiency in a place like Egypt where everybody was a slave, basically. Human beings are there to work 24/7. Just take time off to eat and rest as they need to, but everybody's just kind of a human worker. And so the Sabbath system kind of says, no, there's more to life than working. And I'm sure Chedmeyer is going to have a lot to say about Sabbath, so I'm not going to go a whole lot into it. Honoring your father and your mother, that takes on really interesting meaning when you're talking about a village where the only really valuable people are the people who can work and work in the fields. So, you get to an age where you're the one working the family farm, but your parents are still there eating and they can't work. And what are we going to do with them? So it was really important to say, yeah, you got to continue taking care of your parents and other people that can't work if you want this all to work. And then, you know, don't murder. That's kind of obvious. You know, that would be
They're all obvious.
one way of taking your neighbor's plot as your own. I mean, a lot of this is about, you know, don't take anything away. Don't take anybody's life. Don't take anybody's spouse. Don't take anybody's stuff. Don't lie about them, and don't covet their stuff. Even don't try to get anything that belongs to your neighbor to be your own. And so, I mean, we could spend a lot of time talking about that, but it's whether, you know, that was given to Moses on a mountain, or, you know, where exactly that document came from, we don't know. But it's the model of the covenant like that it has been found in other societies around, and the difference is that for this covenant, the covenant is directly with God, and for the Hittites and the Egyptians and everybody else, their king might issue a covenant that looks like that, but it would be a covenant with the king to take care of you. And we won't spend a lot of time talking about that, but I did want to get to 1 Samuel 8, which was where the people, after a while of doing this, felt like they should have a king, just like all the other countries did. And there's this wonderful passage in 1 Samuel 8 where he kind of lays it out and says, well, I can get you a king, but here's what's going to happen. So somebody want to just read through that one out loud real quick, because it's kind of fun.
These will be the ways of the king who will reign over you. He will take your sons and appoint them to his chariots and to be his horsemen and to run before his chariots. There will be a draft. And he will appoint for himself commanders of thousands, of commanders of 50s, and some to plow his ground and to reap his harvest, and to make his implements of war and the equipment of his chariots. He will take your daughters to be perfumers and cooks and bakers. He will take the best of your fields and vineyards and olive orchards and give them to his courtiers. He will take 1/10 of your grain and of your vineyards and give it to his officers and his courtiers. He will take your male and female slaves and the best of your cattle and donkeys and put them to his work. He will take 1/10 of your flocks, and you shall be his slaves. And in that day you will cry out because of your king, whom you have chosen for yourselves, and the Lord will not answer you in that day.
So it's a pretty thorough takedown of all the bad things that happen once you get kings involved. Because, you know, not only does the king have to eat, but the king can take whatever he wants, which could be your kids, could be your livestock, could be your fields, and appoint all kinds of people to work for him and live in houses in the palace or in the cities, and those people have to eat. And so you get this whole layer of people that are part of your society who don't actually produce anything useful, like food.
Right. Yeah, it's exactly what's happening with Putin and his oligarchs now. Everything was fine as long as those who were serving were happy to serve, but now the draft is out there, and picked up several 100,000 men. I don't know if it's really, if they've gotten that many or not, all ready to go, but Putin is now moved to his palace with the secret location. which is where you need to be when people want to come looking for you to kill you because
Uh-huh.
they
Yeah.
don't like what you and your oligarch friends are doing. It's as old as history, right?
Oh, absolutely. It's not that different from what was happening in Egypt back before they set
Right.
up their villages.
All right. The king has to have a few people, like as you said, who don't do anything useful, who somehow back him up. And there generally is, the guys that he meets at the city club.
Yeah. And Horsley spends a lot of time going into all of the abuses that go along once you have all of this extra levels of government, because the people who are, you have to have tax collectors and enforcers and all of that. So, your particular region would have a governor who reported directly to the king, but that governor, the governor, might be a good person who treats everybody fairly, but if the governor, it put those kind of people in a position to take advantage of people who were falling on hard times. So the business of not profiting off other people's misery kind of goes by the wayside, because profiting off other people's misery is what human beings do when they can get away with it. And so there's all kinds of, let's say you're running short, you need to borrow some seed grain so you can plant this year's crop. And so this governor will offer to loan you what you need, and maybe kind of ignore the don't charge interest thing or whatever. But I mean, there's a debt cycle thing that happens. People have to borrow and then they can't pay that back, so they have to borrow some more. And eventually they have to hand over their land, their ancestral plot of land, to the loan shark, and then they become landless. They become day laborers. They become they're no longer able to provide for their family. And I'm certain we can see all kinds of echoes of this throughout our world today. It's a pretty good description by Samuel, though, of what happens. I'm going to read a couple of quick examples from the prophets. We got into some of this last year in the prophets class, about some of the abuses of the covenant were pretty clearly explained in some of these prophetic passages. And Horsley makes an interesting comment, which was that interpretations of the Old Testament prophets for a long time kind of treated them as though the prophets were speaking to all of the people. And we're talking about, general things that people did wrong. And Horsley says, no, they were speaking truth to power. These prophetic passages were aimed at the people who were in power and who were oppressing, not at the 99%, but at the 1%. So we have things like, verse 2 there of Micah: they covet fields and seize them, houses and take them away. They oppress householder and house people and their inheritance. So, direct violation of the coveting commandment, right? You covet fields and seize them. And then this passage from Isaiah: the Lord enters into judgment with the elders and princes of his people. It is you who have devoured the vineyard, The spoil of the poor is in your houses. What do you mean by crushing my people, by grinding the face of the poor, says the Lord God of hosts. Or Amos. Amos gets very specific. This one's kind of fun. Hear this, you that trample on the needy and bring to ruin the poor of the land, saying, when will the new moon be over so that we may sell grain, and the Sabbath so that we may offer wheat for sale? So that's, there's all kinds of levels of, can't wait for the Sabbath to be over so we can sell stuff when we're not even supposed to be selling anything under this system. But at least we don't do it on the Sabbath, so it's okay. There's just all kinds of levels of abuse and hypocrisy in this stuff. We will make the ephah small and the shekel great. That's a reference to messing with the scales. So, you know, you lend and pay back without interest, right? But maybe when you borrow this, we kind of tilt the scale one direction, and then when you pay it back, we put our thumb on the scale, or we take our thumb off the scale, and actually make you pay back more than what you borrowed. We're not actually charging interest. We're just kind of, adjusting the scale. They practice deceit with false balances, buying the poor for silver and the needy for a pair of sandals, and selling the sweepings of the wheat. That would be a reference to, not gleaning properly. If you actually, sweeping up the extra wheat that fell on the ground and selling that, then that leaves nothing for the gleaners. So anyway, these prophets are full of wonderful takedowns of the abuses. I think I'll just close for tonight with a couple more prophetic passages about what the vision is. The prophets also talked about what would it look like if everything was done correctly. What would God's justice on earth look like? And if you look at where's the best part? This passage from Micah that has get down to verse 3. He shall judge between many peoples and shall arbitrate between strong nations far away. They shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. But they shall all sit under their own vines and under their own fig trees, and no one shall make them afraid, for the mouth of the Lord of hosts has spoken. So sort of this vision of covenant justice that I always like hearing that phrase. Everybody's sitting under their own fig tree and just smiling and enjoying the fruit of their own labor. The notion that you should be able to enjoy the fruit of your own labor is a real key part of this economic justice. And that one certainly echoes through our world today in ways we could talk about. Isaiah 65, they shall build houses and inhabit them. They shall plant vineyards and eat their fruit. So you're not building houses for somebody else. That's slave labor. That's indentured labor. That's not part of the covenant system. But building a house for yourself to live in is. They shall not build and another inhabit. They shall not plant and another eat. For like the days of a tree shall the days of my people be, and my chosen shall long enjoy the work of their hands. They shall not labor in vain or bear children for calamity, for they shall be offspring blessed by the Lord and their descendants as well. So lots there about what the ideal biblical justice system would look like. And we could find lots and lots of ways that that's abused today, and lots of ways where it's kind of hard to apply today. But some of those principles of not profiting off of other people's misery, and about not taking advantage of people, and of people having a chance to enjoy the fruits of their own labors. I think there's a lot of principles there that continue to apply today that we can continue to talk about over the next few weeks.
I wonder if Scott would want to say anything about what you're thinking about for next week, Scott, where we're going with this.
I have not begun putting that together, so I think we'll
Okay.
just have to take potluck on it right now.
Yeah, so I need to say that we have the booklet from Ched Myers that I'd like to get out some more copies of. I think I sent them to some of you. And in fact, Chris, would you like a copy of that?
Offer it to others first, just because Monday nights I'm often sharing. This is not always a good time for me. It just kind of lucked out tonight. So I'd like to,
Okay.
but I'm not sure.
Yeah, anyway, the booklet is kind of a summary of Ched's work on what he calls Sabbath justice, which is kind of the same principles that we're talking about here. And in 2 weeks, he's going to be talking about, I don't remember which passage it was, maybe Scott remembers, one of the more difficult stories in Luke about economic justice. And his booklet is full of other, it's mostly New Testament focused. He talks about some of the same stuff we talked about tonight, but then moves into mostly teachings of Jesus kind of stuff.
The New Testament scholar, actually. Yeah.
Yeah. But I think what you'll find is that, or at least I have found, is that this kind of foundational understanding of the village economics of the early Hebrews echoes so much through everything that follows in the Bible. And what Dr. Horsley says is that Jesus was just flat out a renewal reformer who was going from village to village, trying to get people to, Jesus' vision of the kingdom of God was kind of a reestablishment of this kind of sense of justice for the people of Galilee and other regions around there. And so it's kind of where we're headed, is more application of all of this, 1,000 years later, when the Roman Empire was in effect and Jesus was teaching.
And here we are 2,000 years hence. And then what?
Yeah. Well, there's the whole
It's
thing
good.
about,
That's a good reason to look at it.
yeah. And that there's a whole lot of, we could have a long discussion about, the founding of this country and how much they relied on this sort of model of wanting, they didn't want a king, and they tried to set up a system, and we have some remnants of that today. So anyway, lots of directions we can go. I'm going to be on the East Coast next week, so if I'm awake at 10 p.m., I will join this.
Oh, gosh. Okay.
Okay, so Dan, why don't you just stick around for a minute after we close so that I can show you, so I can help you
Okay, yeah.
on Zoom.
Yeah. Thanks, Dan.
Too, Dan, I don't know who's responsible for getting it on the calendar, the Zoom link. That was confusing tonight, and I think we're
Oh,
used to
yes,
being
we-
able
I
to-
brought it to Lisa's
You
attention.
were aware of that. You have something, yeah, it's Lisa's responsibility, and she actually did do it, but she just made sort of like a small error where she made the entry so that it was only visible to her. And, you know, she has different things she uses the calendar for. So she just made a little error and we pointed it out today. And she thought she had fixed it this morning, but it just didn't work. But I'm sure by tomorrow she'll fix it and she'll fix it going forward. And that was her intent. And
Right.
it was just, we just goofed. I put it on the Facebook group, Southminster Connections, just hoping
Oh.
that maybe somebody would see it there, but we knew it was going to be a little confusing tonight for people.
Yeah.
Okay.
So thank
Okay.
you all for finding it.
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks for pointing it out where it was again, Dan. Yeah. Okay.
Great.
Good night. Thank you,
All right.
Dan.
Hey,
Good
Yeah,
trip.
Dan.
Sounds like fun.